A 92-year-old woman faces off against a ruthless biker gang, then one call changes everything. The ending will leave you speechless. Want more incredible stories of courage and resilience? Make sure to hit that subscribe button. Eleanor Hayes, a name carried through the whispers of time, a woman whose legacy was etched into the very fabric of history. She lived in a quiet corner of Charleston, South Carolina, in a weathered home where the paint peeled from the shutters and the front porch creaked beneath her rocking chair. Mornings were hers to savor, black coffee in hand, eyes tracing the world beyond her doorstep. At 92, Eleanor had earned the right to a peaceful life, but fate had written her a far different story. She had been a soldier long before she became an old woman in a rocking chair. A field medic in the Korean War, one of the few black women to serve on the front lines. Her hands, now lined with time, had once steadied the wounded. Her voice had once whispered hope in the darkest hours of battle. But Eleanor never boasted of her past. Her stories were treasures, locked away, shared only with those who had truly earned them: a trusted neighbor, a lifelong friend, or a grandchild with just enough curiosity to ask about the medals gathering dust on her mantle. Little did she know, one ordinary day would awaken the warrior within her once more. But one evening, the past and the present would collide, and Eleanor Hayes would remind the world that courage does not fade with age. Life in this sleepy Charleston neighborhood moved at a steady, unhurried pace. Mornings began with the soft clatter of bicycle wheels on pavement, the chatter of children on their way to school, and the rustling of palmetto leaves swaying in the coastal breeze. For Eleanor Hayes, mornings were sacred. She'd sit on her worn wooden porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in hand, soaking in the gentle rhythm of life around her. But on one humid Tuesday afternoon, that peace was shattered. The first sign was the sound: a low, menacing rumble that rolled down the street like a storm. Motorcycles. A line of black and chrome beasts roared their way into the neighborhood, their engines snapping the air apart. The bikers were young, loud, and unapologetic, clad in scuffed leather jackets and steel-toed boots. Their very presence felt like an invasion, a jagged, out-of-place disruption in a neighborhood where screen doors creaked and wind chimes sang in the afternoon sun. Then, without hesitation, they pulled over, right in front of Eleanor's house. Engines sputtered before cutting out. A moment of silence. Then laughter, not the warm kind, not the easy kind. No, this was sharp, mocking, laced with arrogance. Eleanor remained still, her thin hands folded neatly in her lap as she watched from the porch. The leader of the pack, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a red bandana wrapped tight around his head, caught her gaze. His smirk was slow, deliberate. Well, look at that," he said, elbowing the guy next to him. "We got ourselves a history lesson on the porch. What do you think, fellas?" "You reckon she remembers when TVS were black and white?" The group erupted in laughter, some hollering, others kicking up dust with their boots. Eleanor didn't flinch, not even a little. Her gray eyes, sharp despite her years, stayed locked on them. No anger, no fear, just a quiet, unwavering presence. Then, without a word, she pushed herself up from the rocking chair, gripping the armrest for support. Slow, steady, deliberate, she turned, walked inside. Closed the door, a simple action, but somehow it made the air shift. The bikers took it as an invitation, or maybe a challenge. One of them cranked up a portable speaker, blasting ear-splitting rock music into the still afternoon. Another revved his engine, sending sharp bursts of noise ricocheting off the quiet houses. More laughing, more taunting. Behind drawn curtains, neighbors watched, nervous, cautious, unwilling to step in. But Eleanor, she was far from done. For Eleanor, this wasn't just noise, it was a test. She had faced far greater battles in her lifetime: gunfire on the front lines, whispered prejudices in barracks, the weight of being a black woman in a military that often refused to see her worth. Compared to that, a few punk kids with motorcycles were nothing more than flies buzzing in the heat. That evening, Eleanor stepped onto her porch again, but this time she carried a broom. She swept the wooden planks, slow and steady, as if the blaring music and laughter were nothing more than a pesky summer wind. The bikers took notice. "Hey, Grandma. Careful with that broom, don't want to throw your back out," one of them hollered. The group erupted into laughter, slapping each other's shoulders, reveling in their own amusement. Eleanor paused. She looked up, not with anger, not with fear, but with something colder, stronger, steel. The kind of look that could stop a soldier mid-step. The kind that spoke of experience, patience, and a warning all wrapped into one. For a fleeting second, the laughter faltered. Without a word, Eleanor turned, stepped inside, and closed the door. But she knew silence wouldn't be enough. These men were testing limits, pushing further each time. She could feel it, see it in the way they moved, the way they claimed the street like it belonged to them. She walked to the kitchen, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of an old rotary phone. It had been years since she had dialed the number she was now considering. Her gaze shifted to a faded photograph hanging on the wall. A younger Eleanor, standing tall in her army uniform, flanked by comrades who had fought beside her, their bond unbreakable, forged in the heat of war. She let out a slow, measured breath. No, she wouldn't let a bunch of loud-mouthed punks decide what kind of life she lived. She knew exactly what needed to be done. But the time had to be right. The next day, they came back. Louder, bolder, more obnoxious. The engines roared as they pulled up in front of Eleanor's house, their tires screeching against the pavement like some kind of territorial display. Neighbors watched from behind their curtains, their unease thick in the air. This wasn't just some rowdy group passing through. This was a message. They were staking their claim. Eleanor sat on her porch once more, her hands resting lightly on her lap. Her calm stood in stark contrast to the chaos around her. Then, the leader, the one with the red bandana, the cocky swagger, sauntered over, his boots crunching on gravel as he stopped at her picket fence. Leaning against it, he flashed that same smug grin. "Hey, Granny," he called out, voice dripping with amusement. "Ever think about moving to a nursing home? The street's a little too lively for someone like you." The group roared with laughter, clapping each other on the back like they'd just delivered the joke of the year. Eleanor didn't blink, didn't flinch, didn't move. She just sat there, watching, waiting. Because they had no idea what was coming next, Eleanor didn't respond. She remained seated, her calm, unwavering gaze locked onto the leader. There was something about the way she looked at him, not scared, not angry, just knowing. And that unsettled him, though he'd never admit it. But the harassment wasn't just words. They started tossing empty beer cans onto her lawn, watching with smug amusement as she picked them up, one by one. She never complained. She never reacted. She just placed each can into a trash bag, her movements slow, methodical, deliberate. But inside, she was taking notes, every jeer, every insult, every laugh logged, remembered, stored. Because these boys, they had no idea who they were dealing with. By the third day, the bikers had grown bolder. They set up camp on the sidewalk, acting like they owned the place, blaring music, tossing cigarette butts onto her porch, turning her once pristine lawn into a trash heap. The leader, the one with the red bandana, leaned back against his bike, smirking. "Maybe you don't mind the mess, huh?" he shouted over the music. "Figured an old lady like you wouldn't care. Probably can't even see straight anymore." More laughter, more mocking, but this time, one of the younger bikers hesitated. His smirk wavered. His gaze flickered toward Eleanor, uncertain. "Maybe we're going too far," he muttered. The leader barely spared him a glance. "What's she gonna do?" he scoffed. "Call the cops, please. They won't bother with some harmless fun." And in that moment, Eleanor knew he was right. But she wasn't calling the police, because some battles required a different kind of strategy. She wasn't intimidated. She was waiting. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the pavement, the bikers' laughter echoed through the street. And then Eleanor stepped onto her porch. But this time, she wasn't carrying a broom. She wasn't picking up trash. She held an old rotary phone in one hand and a worn notebook in the other. Its pages were filled with names and numbers she hadn't looked at in decades. Her fingers trembled not from fear, not from age but from the weight of what she was about to do. She dialed a number she hadn't called in over 40 years. One ring, two, three. And then a voice, gruff, deep, steady. But beneath it, something else. A flicker of surprise and respect. "Eleanor, is that really you?" She closed her eyes for half a second, took a breath. "It's me, Arthur," she said, her voice unwavering. "I need a favor." On the other end of the line, Arthur Hayes, her younger brother, her blood, and a retired Army Ranger, went quiet, but Eleanor could hear the shift in his breathing, the way the air thickened between them. He didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, firm, and absolute. "Say no more. I'll handle it." Eleanor hung up the phone and returned to her chair on the porch, her expression unreadable. The bikers were still laughing, oblivious to the storm brewing just beyond their sight. By the time they realized what was coming, it would be far too late. The morning air carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky remained clear, stubborn, unyielding. Eleanor stood by her kitchen window, watching them gather again. Their laughter grated against her nerves. But she didn't flinch, didn't react. Her face remained calm, her hands steady as she poured herself a cup of black coffee, steam curling from the rim. This was the day everything would change. Arthur had told her, "I'll handle it," and she believed him. But Eleanor had spent a lifetime fighting her own battles on the front lines, in boardrooms, in streets where people thought they could walk all over her. This would be no different. As she took a slow sip, her gaze flickered to a framed photo sitting on the counter. Charles, her husband, her rock, gone 20 years now, but his voice was as clear as if he'd spoken yesterday. "Never let them see you sweat, Eleanor, even when they're trying to break you." A sharp clatter snapped her from the thought. A beer can rolled across the porch. She set the cup down and walked to the door. The leader was back, smirking like a fox in a henhouse. "You don't give up, do you?" he sneered. "Most people would have begged us to leave by now." Eleanor opened the door, but she didn't step outside. She simply looked at him, calm, steady, unwavering. And with the same soothing, deliberate tone she once used to talk panicked soldiers off the edge, she said, "You should enjoy your fun while it lasts." Her words sliced through the air like a blade on glass. The leader's grin wavered just for a second. A flicker of uncertainty, but then, just as quickly, he recovered. "You got a sense of humor, Granny, I'll give you that." He turned back to his crew, but this time, the others weren't laughing. Eleanor closed the door, her heartbeat steady, her mind razor-sharp. And then she picked up the phone again. But this time, it wasn't Arthur she was calling. This number was for Martha Jenkins, a former lieutenant in her unit. One of the most resourceful, ruthless, and loyal women Eleanor had ever known. Martha was retired now, living just a few towns over. But some bonds never fade. The line barely rang before a familiar voice answered, warm, strong, unwavering. "Eleanor, it's been too long." "What's going on?" Eleanor took a breath. And then she told her everything, every insult, every jeer, every piece of trash thrown onto her lawn. Martha listened, silent, calculating. And when Eleanor finished, there was a pause. A long one. Then Martha exhaled, slow and deliberate. And when she spoke, her voice held a dangerous edge. "I'll be there by nightfall." "Well," Martha said, her voice turning sharp, measured. "You know I'm not one to sit around doing nothing. And lucky for you, I've got a few old friends who'd love to pay those boys a visit." Eleanor allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "I knew you'd say that." Later that afternoon, as the bikers continued their racket, Eleanor sat on her porch, her expression calm, patient, waiting. Her eyes flickered toward the younger biker again, the one who seemed out of place among them. He sat apart from the rest, his gaze lingering on her, his shoulders tense. For a brief moment, Eleanor considered speaking to him, but then she let it go. His moral struggle, however faint, wasn't her responsibility. She had bigger plans. The hours dragged on. The sun dipped behind the houses, stretching long, dark shadows across the street. The bikers showed no signs of leaving, but Eleanor, because she knew what was coming, and when the first set of headlights appeared at the end of the street, her lips curled into a subtle, knowing smile. Two SUVs rolled in, slow, purposeful. Their engines hummed not loud, not aggressive, but controlled. The bikers didn't notice at first, too caught up in their music, their laughter, their own arrogance. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, folding her hands neatly in her lap. Time to teach these boys a lesson, she murmured to herself. The first SUV came to a halt directly across the street from Eleanor's house. The second pulled in right behind it. Then the doors opened, not rushed, not aggressive. Calculated, intentional, and outstepped for men. They didn't need to speak to command attention. They just stood there, older, worn, each wearing black jackets, an insignia stitched onto the chest, a crest that carried weight, a mark of their time as Army Rangers. And then Arthur stepped forward. He wasn't dressed for war, but he didn't have to be. His imposing frame, silver-streaked beard, and sharp eyes did all the talking. He had the stance of a man who had seen things, done things. And he wasn't impressed by what he was looking at. Behind him stood three men, his closest friends. All retired military, all trained to handle situations exactly like this. The bikers froze mid-laugh, their heads snapped toward the newcomers. The leader, still leaning against Eleanor's fence, straightened up. His cocky grin wavered just for a moment. He sized them up, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. And then Arthur's eyes locked onto him, a stare like stone, unshaken, unapologetic, and suddenly, the smirk disappeared entirely from the leader's face. A slow, unbearable silence stretched between them. Then Arthur spoke. "You must be the one who's been bothering my sister." His voice was calm to calm, and that was the most dangerous kind of calm there was. His words carried weight. The kind of weight that silence amplifies. "Sister," the leader echoed the word, his confidence wavering as he flicked a glance toward Eleanor. She sat there, watching the scene unfold, a faint smile playing on her lips, calm, knowing, unbothered. The leader cleared his throat. We were just hanging out." Arthur took a slow step forward. His hands rested loosely at his sides, but there was nothing casual about his presence. "Hanging out," he repeated, his voice flat, measured. "By throwing trash on her lawn, blasting music all night, mocking a woman who's done more for this country than you could ever imagine." The bikers shifted uneasily. The cocky bravado drained from their faces, leaving behind nothing but uncertainty and discomfort. One of them muttered something under his breath. The leader waved him off, trying to keep some semblance of control. "Look, we didn't mean any harm," he said. His voice lacked the edge it had before. Now, it was defensive. It was just some fun. Arthur didn't break eye contact, didn't blink, didn't move. "Let me tell you what fun looks like to me," he said, his voice low even. "Fun is respecting people who've earned it. Fun is knowing when to back off before you bite off more than you can chew." The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. And the bikers, they weren't laughing anymore. Van MCC Hunt, young biker, the one who had seemed uneasy from the start, took a step back. Just a small one, but it was enough. Enough to show where he stood. His eyes flickered toward Eleanor. And in them, for just a second, guilt. Before the leader could find his voice again, another car pulled up behind the SUVs, Martha. She stepped out, sharp as ever, in a navy blazer, her presence just as commanding as Arthur's. And behind her, two more men, local veterans, men who had known Eleanor for decades, men who had fought beside her husband, men who weren't about to let this disrespect slide. Martha surveyed the scene, her sharp eyes landing on the biker leader like a spotlight. She tilted her head, unimpressed. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with." Her words were quiet, but they cut deeper than any threat. The leader shifted his weight, suddenly less sure of himself. "Do you have any idea who she is?" Martha took a step forward, her heels clicking against the pavement. "What she's done," she scoffed, She served this country when people like you wouldn't even lift a damn finger." Another step, the leader involuntarily leaned back. "You think your little antics intimidate her?" She laughed a cold, sharp sound. "You're nothing but noise." The leader's mouth opened, grasping for some kind of comeback. But before he could get a single word out, Arthur's eyes snapped to him. And that look alone shut him up. Arthur took a breath. And then, enough, just one word. But it carried the weight of a command that wasn't up for debate. He gestured toward the motorcycles. "Get on your bikes and get the hell off this street. Pick up your trash, get on your bikes, and leave." Arthur's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel underneath it. "If you're smart, you'll think twice before coming back here. Or bothering anyone else like this again." For a moment, no one moved, no one dared. Then reluctantly, stiffly, the leader gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to his crew, and just like that, the swagger was gone. They started gathering the trash, their movements hurried, tense. Not a single word was spoken. Arthur and his team didn't have to raise their voices. Didn't have to throw a single punch. Their presence alone had been enough. As the bikers mounted their motorcycles, their engines rumbling low, Arthur turned to Eleanor. She met his gaze, a silent exchange, a nod of respect, and then the faintest smile. Justice had been served, but for Eleanor, this wasn't just about reclaiming her peace. This was about teaching these boys something they'd never forget. As the motorcycles rolled away, their growls fading into the distance, the street returned to what it was meant to be, quiet, still, hers again. The neighbors, who had been peeking from windows, watching through cracked doors, finally stepped outside. Slowly, cautiously, they gathered near Eleanor's house, their voices hushed, uncertain. Eyes flickered between her and the group of veterans who had stood by her side. Eleanor, she remained on her porch, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her expression calm, but her message clear. Arthur climbed the porch steps, lowering himself into the empty chair beside her. His presence solid, protective, familiar, brought Eleanor a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just sat there, letting the quiet settle over the neighborhood like a soft blanket. Then, the rhythmic click of heels on pavement. Martha, she approached, her stance firm, her expression satisfied. "They won't be back," she said, matter of fact but kind. "And if they do," she shrugged, "they'll find out what real trouble looks like." Eleanor let out a small chuckle, the sound low, knowing. "I wasn't too worried," she murmured. "I knew you'd come through." Arthur leaned back in his chair, his eyes drifting toward the cluster of neighbors, still hovering near the lawn, unsure what to do. He smirked. "Looks like you've got some explaining to do." Eleanor's smile deepened, but she didn't move to speak. Instead, one of the neighbors, a woman in her 40s named Denise, took a hesitant step forward. "Miss Hayes," Denise began, her voice a mix of awe and apology. "We had no idea about your service, about everything you've done. We should have spoken up sooner." But Eleanor raised a hand, a small but firm gesture that silenced her gently. "There's no need for apologies," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "We all find our strength in different ways. Today just happened to be my turn." Denise nodded, her eyes glistening with emotion. The neighbors slowly dispersed, offering quiet thank yous, warm smiles, and grateful touches as they passed. Some lingered longer, placing their hands over Eleanor's, a silent acknowledgement, a message of respect without words. And then, the street was quiet again. Just as it should be, Arthur turned to Eleanor, his usual stoicism softening. "You know," he said, tilting his head slightly, "you didn't have to handle this alone. You could have called sooner." Eleanor met his gaze, and in her eyes that familiar spark. A hint of mischief, a twinkle of knowing. "And deny you the chance to play the hero?" She mused, "Where's the fun in that?" Arthur let out a deep, genuine laugh, the kind that felt like a memory and a promise all at once. "You haven't changed a bit," he said, shaking his head. Still stubborn as ever, Eleanor just smiled. Then her gaze shifted to him. The young biker, the one who had hesitated. The one who had watched, conflicted, uncertain. Now, as the rest of the bikers rode off, he stayed behind, pacing near the curb, shoulders tense, restless. And then, finally, he walked toward the porch. "I just wanted to say," his voice faltered. He shoved his hands into his jacket pockets, avoiding eye contact. "I didn't mean for things to get this bad. I didn't know who you were." Eleanor studied him, not with judgment, but with understanding. And when she finally spoke, her words were gentle, measured, intentional. "It's not about who I am," she said. "It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are." The young man's shoulders sagged, like the weight of her words had settled in his bones. A long beat of silence, then he nodded. "I'll do better," he murmured. And with that, he turned, walking back to his bike. A moment later he was gone. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, letting out a slow, steady breath. Arthur reached over, patting her hand once. "You've always had a way with words." Eleanor shrugged, her smile small but knowing. "Sometimes people just need a reminder." Arthur stayed a while longer. They didn't fill the silence with unnecessary words. Because sometimes, just being there was enough. And then, Arthur spoke again. "What you did today, it wasn't just about you." Eleanor glanced at him. "Those boys learned something out there," he continued. "Not just about respect, but about courage. And where it truly comes from." Eleanor let his words settle. Then, slowly she smiled. Not for herself, but for the lesson. For the quiet victory, for the peace reclaimed. And as the night settled around them, the street was once again just as it should be. Quiet, strong, and hers. Eleanor nodded slowly. "Courage isn't loud," she said, her voice steady but soft. "It's not about who shouts the most or makes the biggest scene. It's about standing firm when others try to shake you." She hoped he'd understand. Because even those who seem hardened can change if given the chance. But change, it requires accountability. And tonight, she had made sure they understood that. Martha stepped onto the porch, her sharp heels clicking softly against the wooden steps. She crossed her arms, a grin tugging at the corner of her lips. "You've still got it, Eleanor," a chuckle. "I wouldn't want to be on the wrong side of you." Eleanor laughed, low and knowing. "You'd think after all these years, people would know better than to mess with a veteran." Arthur smirked. "Guess some folks have to learn the hard way." For a long moment, the three of them simply stood there, letting the night settle around them. A hush, not just silence, but something deeper and understanding, a quiet triumph, a moment heavy with unspoken meaning. Then Eleanor's gaze shifted, her expression thoughtful. She turned toward the small gathering of neighbors still lingering nearby, their faces marked with reflection, realization, and a newfound respect. And when she spoke, it wasn't just to Arthur. It wasn't just to Martha, it was to all of them. "Courage isn't about standing alone," she said, her voice steady, carrying the weight of years and wisdom. "It's about standing together. Don't wait for someone else to act. Sometimes, bravery means being the first to speak." The words lingered in the air, a lesson, a challenge, a truth. Because real strength, it isn't about size or power. It's about conviction, it's about unity. And then Eleanor turned, stepped inside. The door clicked shut behind her, and just like that, her home was still once more. The street fell silent, but the impact of what had happened that night, that would remain in the hearts of those who had witnessed it.